Hello everybody. I'm really sorry I can't be there at this important event. I got an invitation to visit the Oracle of the Dead in Thesprotia, which I simply couldn't turn down. Among other things, I'm going to try to raise the ghost of Tony, to tell him how much we all appreciated what he did for the study of Greek. Thank you. It was inevitable that Tony Harrison would eventually make a film poem. In one of his few prose essays, first published in 1984, called Flicks and This Fleeting Life, he describes how as a child he'd been an early and avid film devotee. He recalls the Leeds cinemas where he spent his Saturdays, the Pavilion, the Crescent, the Rex, the Malvern, the Beeston Picture House. He loved Disney and James Cagney movies and Laurel and Hardy. There was also a small cinema, the News Theatre, where he saw the newsreel footage of the Nazi concentration camps. I felt, he recalled, that jumbling cascade of bulldozed, emaciated Belsen bodies were being dumped onto the Art Deco carpet of the cinema and into my consciousness forever. It made me draw a line between what I knew in my heart was pretend, the films that entertained me and made me laugh, and what was news, real dead bodies bulldozed into pits at Bergen-Belsen. This newsreel changed my attitude to life and film forever. It also appeared in The Gaze of the Gorgon, discussed by my colleagues here today. One of the films he saw was W.H. Auden's Night Mail of 1934, commissioned by the GPO, with a mesmerising score by the then 22-year-old Benjamin Britten. Auden animated the mail train as if it were a purposeful, muscular animal crossing the country at night. The rhythm of the verse mimics the piston beat and the wheel clatter of a steam locomotive.
This is the night mail crossing the border, bringing the check and the postal order, letters for the rich, letters for the poor, the shop at the corner and the girl next door, pulling up, beat took a steady climb, the gradients against her, but she's on time.
50 years later, Tony made the film poem that launched his career in this medium, The Big H, 1984. It was commissioned by Melvyn Bragg for the South Bank show, and Tony spoke about being inspired by Auden in an interview that preceded it.
8:30 p.m. Weekdays and Sundays. The Down Postal Special leaves Euston for Glasgow, Edinburgh and Aberdeen.
I saw Night Mail when I was in my late teens, I think. And for me, it was important because it was the first time I'd ever heard poetry and film together, and that for me was unique. And it stayed in my mind since I saw it, and always thinking, oh, I'd like to do that. Because at the back of my mind, I've always wanted to have a crack at verse and film because they seem to me uniquely related.
The Big H wasn't a film poem. It was a film of verses about King Herod being performed by Leeds school children. It adumbrates his later films, including the classics-themed ones, by its reflections on the fear of the H-bomb, a symbol of destruction and fear that haunted his entire generation and found its extended articulation in the shadow of Hiroshima 1995. Tony's delight in that unique synergy between verse in metre and the frame sequences of film is apparent in all his film poems, including Crossings, a revisiting of Auden's Night Mail that was broadcast in ITV by 2002, 17 years after the miners' strike and 4 after his mining-focused feature film Prometheus, the miners are still on Harrison's mind. As the train in Crossings reaches northern England, the narrator views the ruins of the once proud industrial landscape its farmland also recently devastated by the slaughter of cattle during the foot and mouth epidemic of 2001. The modern night mail threads through the map of mining communities thrown on the scrap. Collieries culled like shill bottles shotten, winding gear felled, workforce forgotten, along with culled cattle, culled kingdoms of coal, one dumped on the bonfire, one on the dole. Tony's first experience of film editing had, however, come decades earlier with the montage of martial clips from documentaries and newsreel with which his Nigerian Lysistrata, Aikin Martyr, had opened in 1964, proving his prescience and appetite for innovation. Although it's now ubiquitous, the incorporation of video within live theatre, although not altogether unprecedented in Eastern European performances, was unheard of in Britain in 1964. And in that production, Harrison's Nigerian Lysistrata put a sudden stop to the filmed competence by throwing a water pot at the screen on the back wall, thus exploiting the power of the hard cut. Harrison's 4 film poems on classical themes, recorded partly in Greece between 1992 and 2000, all featured his favourite statue motif and the idea of a long journey across Central or Eastern Europe. The others were The Gaze of the Gorgon, 1992, A Maybe Day in Kazakhstan, 1994, and Metamorphose, 2000. These and Harrison's 7 other experiments with combining film and poetry are regarded as setting the definitive standard in British cinema. They're unique in that all the poetry evolved simultaneously with the filming process, not before it. Alongside his creation of the moving images, flickering through time at 24 frames per second, these films also reveal his engagement with static works of visual art. In The Gaze of the Gorgon, his sole extended engagement with the Homeric Iliad, he adopts a statue of Heine as narrator, exploring the tragic history of European warfare in Heine's own verse form, the couplet. Tony knew that the statue of the Jewish poet was removed from the Bavarian royal family's summer palace on Khufu on the orders of Kaiser Wilhelm II. A Maybe Day in Kazakhstan was supposed to be voiced by Melina Mercouri, but she died on the 6th of March and Tony had to step in. It's a film about the fall of the Soviet Union and the migration of people all the way from Kazakhstan to Greece. It dwells on the legacy of empire, the violence of political systems and regime change, and especially the human cost amongst the poorest classes of ideological transformations. The film was funded and produced by Channel 4, and that was in association with the Foundation of Hellenic Culture. The stars are a group of Greeks whose forefathers had once moved to the Black Sea, perhaps at the time of Catherine the Great's Hellenization program. But these are people whom Stalin brutally deported, especially from Georgia, to Central Asian collectives between 1937 and 1949. The camera lingers on their faces, especially of the older men and women, while Harrison intones couplets such as "Cold, dark deportation trains still jolt and judder through their brains." The journeys made by them and their forebears are equated with those of the classical Argonauts. They now survive by selling obsolete Soviet memorabilia at an Athenian flea market. Co-directed by Harrison and Mark Kiddell and edited by Julian Sabbath, this film contains some of the most bravura cutting of image against word in all of Harrison's entire filmic oeuvre. This movie feels more like a documentary than most of Harrison's film poems. The viewer is informed not only about the Kazakhstani Greek communities, but about Soviet propaganda and ancient democracy and Cleisthenes, democracy's first dreamer. Harrison was influenced by the British documentary a tradition that was founded by John Grierson. Now, he developed film as a way of investigating and recording everyday social and working life. One of the first films Grierson had produced was the GPO Film Unit documentary Coal Face, 1935, which mightily influenced Harrison's Prometheus. The theme of the market, where the impoverished migrants try to earn their livelihood by selling Red Army uniforms and other Soviet knickknacks, that's developed in a typical Harrisonian critique of free market capitalism in the film's long central stanza. And this is where the comparison with the Argonauts is first introduced. Pavement peddlers trading trash from communism's fatal crash, salvaging the washed-up cargo from their ill-fated shattered Argo. And as the camera zooms in on a statuette of Lenin, Harrison's voiceover develops this image. Doomed Argonauts condemned to peddle the bric-brac, a badge and medal from that doomed voyage that maroons Lenin here with forks and spoons. The climactic sequence is set in on and around the Athenian Acropolis, and a brilliant episode actually filmed in the ancient theatre of Dionysus itself calls to mind the carpet scene in Aeschylus's Agamemnon in profound ways. And I think this may partly be meant as a tribute to Mercouri, whose performance of the role of Clytemnestra in this canonical scene in Carolus Kuhn's 1980 Oresteia had entered the theatrical legend. The fatalities of the Trojan War deplored by the ageing chorus of Agamemnon, the violent murder of the Argive monarch, and the regime change it precipitates charge the film's contemporary context with dark meaning. The red flags of the Soviet Union is spread out across the orchestra leading to the stage and trampled underfoot by a little girl who represents the future. She's accompanied by an elderly Kazakhstani musician playing a forward-driving, hypnotic melody on his shirta, and that's a small, short-necked, two-stringed instrument carved from a single piece of wood and covered with leather. I'd like you to notice in this clip how the sound of the music and the steps the child takes orally and visually reinforce the recited poetry, how the camera lingers on the old man's features and mysterious smile, and especially the focus towards the end on the face of the satyr supporting the stage, an image which had inspired a motif in Jocelyn Herbert's stage design for the play Trackers of Oxyrhynchus just a few years previously.
The people's flags of deepest red spread for tender feet to tread. Those scarlet standards he saw fly above his and other heads, held high in Kazakhstan when he was Russian. Now he's Greek, he watches cushion the girl's first cautious tread onto the path of fallen red.
Years of experimentation with mutually reinforcing both word and image through careful editing of clip against metre, producing what he calls the scansions of edited sequences, came to a climax in Tony's powerful 1998 feature film Prometheus. This confronts the viewer with a procession of arresting images leading from northern England to Eastern Europe and Greece via the bombing of Dresden. the collapse of socialism and the Holocaust. This procession advances, its sequential logic dictated by poetic values rather than strict chronology, with a measured pace enhanced by Alistair Cameron's meticulous camera work and by precision editing. The elderly Promethean minor hero of the film says, "Fire and poetry, two great powers that make this so-called God's world ours." Tony had been fascinated by the fire glowing in his family fireplace as a child. He feels that his poetic gift was nurtured by gazing into its flames. Later, he compared fires in dark grates and the light emitted by the screen in darkened cinemas. Prometheus is a significant artistic reaction to the fall of the British working class as the 20th century staggered to its close and the socialist dream collapsed internationally. The film also offers a path-breaking adaptation of classical myth for a radical political purpose. Harrison believed that the ancient Greek tragedy entitled Prometheus Bound, the authorship of course is contested, is indeed by Aeschylus as the poet of the Athenian democratic revolution. The Prometheus is stubborn, audacious, gloomy, inspirational, intellectual, poetic, and has a diachronic view of history. He can see far across the world into the past and the future. And Harrison's film is also stubborn, audacious, gloomy, inspirational, intellectual and poetic, with an international perspective and a diachronic historical viewpoint. The opening sequence has Kratos and Beer, masked nuclear power workers looming through the steam of cooling towers. Another episode involves the wild-eyed Io finding comfort by embracing the monumental gold statue of Prometheus, which dominates the later stages of the film. A haunting image is the Oceanids, who are actually women workers at a fish canning factory, their pale fishnet veils fluttering across sad, beautiful masks. They float on a raft down the River Humber. That's an industrial heartland to Richard Blackford's atmospheric music, which is emitted by the Humber Bridge's suspension cables. Hermes, Zeus's lackey, is played with patrician menace by Michael Feast, whom Tony chose partly because of his striking resemblance to Peter Mandelson and his ability to speak in upper middle class English accents, hard as cut glass.
Why, you might ask, should gods come into this world of e-by-gum? Those dropped H's help disguise the fact I've flown down from the skies, just as steel-capped boots conceal the wings that sprout out of each heel. I hid the fact by talking broad that I'm a posh Olympian lord. It took just a few by-eckers likes and ecky thumps to con these tykes into believing that this god was just a fellow northern sod, playing darts and dominoes, and Zeus help me, speaking prose. I mean an immortal Hermes, me, not spouting proper poetry.
But the oratorical highlight is given to Walter Sparrow's Promethean old man, who puts his warm, northern, working-class voice to superb use in his nostalgic monologue on smoking. He ruminates on the pleasure and sexual allure cigarettes, as represented on the silver screen, used to offer. Who smokes now? Them were the days when women smoked in negligees. The old man's smoking habit constitutes, in Marxist terms, an example of the dialectical unity of opposites. To smoke is a sign of working class identity and even solidarity. Smoking remains a class issue in the UK. And the ultimate sign, too, of the personal liberty which the old man refuses to yield to his capitalist masters. Yet it's forced on him by multinational tobacco corporations and is killing him. The film is neither a translation nor an adaptation, but it is inspired by the Aeschylean tragedy and is informed by its confrontations. The cast includes familiar figures: Prometheus, Oceanids, Hermes, Io, plus Minos, a Minos' small son, his mother and grandmother. The screenplay quotes the ancient Aeschylean tragedy, notably in the early scene in which the boy's homework consists of reading a trenchant rhymed version of Prometheus's philanthropy monologue. And please notice here the hard cutting of the first few images, the use of a brief musical signal in Hermes' classical tape, and the lingering movement of the camera in synergy with the iambic verses as the camera pans across the humble mining-related ornaments and the brash newspaper headlines.
Men had eyes but didn't see. The sight they now have came from me. They had ears but never heard the beauty of a sound or a word, so that man's earthly life did seem, until my deed a cloudy dream, until I opened ears and eyes to all the life of earth and skies. Before I came, men would be found in sunless dwellings underground. They saw no difference between the winter and the springtime scene. Without me, man would not now know the earth and all that lies below. Underground treasures for his use, to free him from the grip of Zeus. With Prometheus, life began to flourish far benighted man. My gift of fire made mankind free, but I stay in captivity.
This film is a late 20th century antiphonal response to Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, with its choric plurality of voices, frustrated revolutionary power, and sense of the torment implicit in the march of human history. It explores the relationship between the Prometheus myth and the history of Marxist politics. It looks at the material and economic processes that have underpinned capitalism and 20th century communism. There's certainly never been an artwork more aware of its own contextual mode and means of production. Coal is extracted from the earth, cast into fire, and miners' bodies are transformed visually into bullion, a horrific metamorphosis from concrete to abstract labour and thence to symbolic capital. Yet Harrison's scholarship never stands between him and the people he portrays. His classical heroes never overshadow his local heroes. One reason he likes film, he said, is that the cinema screen can give heroic stature to the most humble of faces, an essential requirement in a film where the most unlikely wheezing ex-miner is slowly made to represent Prometheus himself. Now, one reason why Prometheus has been so little watched is that it draws epic inferences from a controversial political moment, the landmark conflict in British post-war socio-economic history. In early 1984, the National Coal Board announced the closure of 20 pits. As it turned out, far more than 20 were eventually closed. They would make more than 20,000 men redundant, removing income from many, many more Britons in allied industries and destroying numerous entire communities across the poorest regions of Wales, Scotland and the northeast of England. Although Harrison's Prometheus is set in its own present of the 1990s, the strike is signalled as the point at which Kirby, the Northern English community it portrays, had been thrown into crisis. The old man carves a coal figure in Promethean pose captioned "Striking Mine" in 1984, and a newspaper article traces the pit closures back to the strike. In defending the mining communities, Harrison has accepted into art heroes even less acceptable than the homeless of Trackers. It's one thing for a poet to support oppressed groups and causes that have been legitimised by mainstream liberal ideology, such as women and ethnic minorities, in whose name countless productions of Greek tragedy have emerged. But it's quite another to make heroes out of the white male working class, especially the NUM. Harrison's constant theme, the inaudibility of high artistic culture, of working class voices, resounds in Prometheus. It addresses humanity's collective need to transcend its own tragic history. The shift from the individual to the collective, from the specific to the universal or general, in terms of Aristotle's Poetics, from the historical to the philosophical, is made by grafting the struggle of the British miners onto the ancient Greek myth. Harrison had originally planned to create a theatrical performance, a dramatic performance of Prometheus Bound on a slag heap in Yorkshire. But when it became clear that all the pits would be closing, he visited them, collecting signage and equipment which physically appear in the film. He also collected newspaper and magazine cuttings, especially accounts of accidents with high death tolls, many photographs and postcards. The terrible legacy of pollution left by heavy industry is as prominent a topic in his notebooks in the Leeds University Library as in the film, whose landscapes make bleak visual poetry out of derelict cooling towers. This is the classical tradition at its most potent, providing proof that capitalism and classicism need not go hand in hand. It also offers a vibrant and class-conscious view of the role of the arts and cinema. The old man spends much of the film in the derelict building of the Palace of Cinema in Nottingley, a real relic of 20th century working class culture. And in the central confrontation between Hermes and the old man, in Dresden and Yorkshire respectively, the camera does some bravura panning between and across paintings, sculpture, and the internal mise-en-abîme cinema screen. Here I'd like to draw your attention to the extraordinary fusion of poetic enjambment and the vertical and horizontal panning across neoclassical statuary.
Though now the damned thing's been redone, this was Zeus's target, number 1. And target 2, Prometheus, black from the bomb blitz blaze, but back on the opera as he was before the Allies bombed him in the war, reinstated where his gaze once watched the whole of Dresden blaze. Here is Dresden's true destroyer, filthy from his own filched foyer. And target 3, much worse, this frees Prometheus freed by Hercules, who shot an arrow from his quiver through the bird that gnawed the liver of Prometheus, and now comes to rend the lungs of our fag-flaunting friend. Unlike the Titan's liver, though, his lungs aren't likely to regrow. This pitiful pulmonary prole carves scrap-heap miners out of coal, conniving in that blasphemy that it wasn't Zeus at all, but he, Prometheus, who formed man from clay. Target 4. That to this day Dresden flaunts up here restored, provoking my Olympian lord.
Tony's last film poem, Metamorphose, 2000, makes a fitting conclusion to this talk because it's an extended meditation on the social and psychological function of poetry, with Tony's narratorial persona fusing with the ancient bard at the end in a personal statement about poetry's capacity to redeem. This film is set against beautiful natural landscapes as it follows Orpheus's dismembered head downstream from the Balkans to Lesbos. And here I'd like you to note how the colours in the poetry help the viewer appreciate the visual pictures, and how the close-up on the head and the distant shots of the sunset gleaming coastal landscape are timed to fit not only the poetry, but the sound of the waves breaking on the shore.
Sun and sea in Gerbera hues, salute to this servant of the muse. Gerbera, orange, yellow, red, flow in the sunset round his head. Though the head is dead and cold, the voice still turns shed blood to gold. The voice that heals and seeks to mend men's broken souls that men's deeds rend. When men are maimed and torn apart, they'll call on Orpheus and his art.